Hello and welcome everybody. We're just welcoming everybody into the Zoom webinar. My name is Andrew Petersen, the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. We'll just give it a few more seconds and hopefully we'll see a few more people join us, and then we will kick off. Thank you. All right, well, it's 1 minute past the half hour, and let's start the proceedings for today. A fun-filled and action-packed day brought to you by Better Futures Australia. As I said, my name is Andrew Petersen. I'm the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia, part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I'm delighted that you could join us today in a very important conversation that we brought to you to engage with you on the activity, the action and the ambition that would have happened at this time this year at a place called Glasgow and an event called COP26. Well, we're bringing you that today. Before I do though, let me begin by acknowledging that I am actually coming to you today on from the land of the 𝗳𝗲𝗰𝗶𝗀𝗶 people. And I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And we're delighted to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us for the purpose of today's webinar. Now, this year was meant to be the super year, and one in which progress was made on the post-2020 agenda to address biodiversity loss, one in which further progress would have been made on global intent to address human rights, and the subject of today's conversation, action on climate change. Now, after the relative disappointment of COP25, and remember that it had its own challenges as it had to be moved from its original location, which was to be in Santiago in Chile, and had to be moved to Madrid in Spain at very short notice, the NGO and the business community and a large number of states and regional and local governments as a community, and for that matter, as I said, a number of countries, primarily led by the European Union, said that 2020 then had to be the year where climate ambition and climate action had to come together in Glasgow, in Scotland for COP26. Now, in fact, that is where I suspect a number of today's speakers and perhaps a number of our attendees today would in fact be right now, but for the dramatic impact that the pandemic has had on our lives and on our livelihoods. This week was in fact to be the second week of global climate negotiations. And perhaps those negotiations are happening in a parallel universe somewhere, if you adhere to the Star Trekian philosophy of parallax universes. But be that as it may, and let's get real here, as a number of politicians will want to say, we live in the real world, and it is that world that while the negotiations certainly did not proceed in the usual way, it's not the reality that action, let alone the issue, has lost any momentum. But what has that momentum looked like? What does it mean for progress on the global connected effort towards net zero? And most importantly for our audience today, why should business know that 2021 already brings a very different risk and reward landscape towards net zero, and that they could be either seriously disrupted by, or taking another view, actively involved in the future discussion and disruption of our global energy, transport, food, and natural resource systems. And how to share that with you? Well, I was delighted and humbled when our expert panel agreed to join us today, enabling us to hear immediately and directly what's going on internationally. But before we do, we've got a poll. And that poll is, can we reach net zero by 2050? So a little bit of audience participation, and we'd love you to give your thoughts on what you think is going to happen. And there we have it. Now, the host and the panelists can't vote. So we're looking to the audience in a fairly binary +1 approach. Can we reach net zero by 2050? And if you don't answer, I'll start humming A Walk in the Black Forest. One of the great fears that everybody has when they invite me to speak on a Zoom webinar. All right, why don't we see what the answers look like? Aha, well, that's confidence. Excellent. Well, we may not need the second poll then. So let me start by welcoming our guest speakers today. And I'm not going to introduce them verbatim in terms of their CVs, because you will see their CVs coming through via the chat function if you would like to follow up the details. But we're delighted that we have Dean Bialek, the head of International Politics Unit at COP26 Climate Champions team, and also the Principal Advisor on Strategy to Mission 2020. We'll then hear from Claire O'Neill, who's the new incoming Managing Director for Climate and Energy at my colleague partner organisation, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And then we'll hear from Emily Kreps, who's at the Capital Markets Director at CDP, or as I like to say, the artist formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. So without further ado, let me hand over to Dean. And as we've set this up, 7 to 10 minutes, Dean, on the way you see it. And the first question being, where would you be right now but for the pandemic? Over to you, Dean.
All right, thanks a lot for the introduction. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining this meeting, the Yuin people on the south coast of New South Wales, and pay my respect to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. To answer your question directly, had it not been for COVID-19, I would most definitely be in Glasgow supporting the UK government's efforts to host COP26. And in particular, and as you mentioned, I'm currently working as a political advisor to Nigel Topping, who has been appointed by the UK government as their high-level champion in preparation for COP26. And the main task there is to galvanise action from non-state actors. So, for example, businesses, investors, cities, regions, in support of the transition to a net zero economy. All of that work is happening under a broad campaign known as the Race to Zero, and we're very quickly gathering up commitments from a large variety of non-state actors in pursuit of that objective. And I should say that that work on the non-state actor piece happens in parallel to the government-to-government negotiations, which is the traditional forum for work under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement that has been adopted under it. I think just stepping back and having a look at the broad landscape, really we're in a moment of extraordinary change. We've had significant disruption, obviously, this year, but I think there are kind of three main axes of this change that we're experiencing at the moment. One is a much deeper understanding of the science and the environmental changes that we're seeing around us. One aspect of that is obviously the impact of increased concentrations of greenhouse gases and climate change, and the approaching of some critical tipping points in our natural climate system that really threaten the way that we live our lives and the resources we have at our disposal to make our way in the world. Some aspects of that and things are kind of interlinking and overlapping all the time, is obviously links with the climate debate, what we've seen in terms of the disruption and health impacts of COVID, also air pollution issues, nature-based solutions and our natural resources that we have at our disposal. So a lot of different facets really coming to the fore now, both in terms of our understanding of those issues as well as our strategies to deal with them. The second main axis of change, I think, is on the economic front, where we're seeing a real stepping away from our fundamental understanding of what drives economic growth and economic activity. Some real shifts in power internationally based on the massive energy transition that we're seeing at the moment. An extraordinary example of that was the projection last week from the International Energy Agency that renewables are going to be the biggest provider of power globally from 2025 onwards. So massive change that we're seeing there as well. And the other issue is also the impact that COVID has had on the global economy and the turning towards the necessary recovery efforts and building into those recovery efforts strategies and policies that put us on a much better track in terms of environmental outcomes, including climate. The third massive change that we're seeing is the geopolitical, and everyone would be aware of recent announcements that have come from the region that is really seen as the hub of growth over the coming decades in Asia. Obviously very important for Australia in terms of its trade relationships, its geographical proximity and its security, and very new perceptions of what is in the national interest for Australia. So, for example, with Korea, with Japan and China all announcing net zero targets, Australia really needs to recalibrate its understandings of what's in its own interest in terms of economic growth and trade going forward, really needing to shift away from the current or historical reliance on fossil fuels and minerals for its positive trade balance, and needing to turn towards other strategies which align more closely with the policies that are starting to emerge in the Asian region, in particular with net zero, a really change in the energy landscape and looking at opportunities for Australia to export in some form the enormous renewable energy power that we have at our disposal. And everyone would be aware of the massive new proposals for renewable energy hubs at export scale, which can harness clean energy in the form of hydrogen for export into Asia. In terms of the preparations for COP26, to some degree, the delay of the COP into next year has come with some advantages despite the enormous difficulties that have arisen as a result of the source of that COVID. One is obviously we now have clarity around the outcome of the US election, even though the guy in the White House might not have that clarity himself. But very clearly, we're going to see an avalanche of new climate action coming forward in the Biden administration's new policies, some extraordinarily ambitious policies, not only in its net zero economy by 2050, but also to change the American energy system into a completely clean system by 2035. And the impact that will have on global geopolitics. We're likely to see, I think, come out of the deep freeze, the bilateral relationship between the US and China, which is so critical to dealing with the climate crisis. I think in Australia need to also be cognizant that there are two very firm expectations in terms of preparations for COP26. The first being that there will be a very big push over the next 12 months for countries to increase the ambition of the targets they have set for 2030 under the Paris Agreement. And in parallel to that, a request for countries to come forward with long-term strategies for mid-century. And there's been a lot of debate over recent times around whether Australia is going to join the growing momentum internationally behind the setting of net zero by 2050 targets. And that pressure is only going to increase over coming days. And I note that Prime Minister Scott Morrison will be meeting with Prime Minister Suga of Japan, who is one of those countries that has recently got on board with the net zero target. Just to quickly finish, I wanted to note that one thing which has garnered a bit of press coverage in the recent past is the climate bill that independent MP 𝗳𝗲𝗃𝗃 has put forward into the Parliament a couple of weeks back. And I wanted to note for all of those on the call that there is an opportunity to make submissions to the Energy and Environment Committee in Parliament in support of that bill. Claire, you'll note, or you may have noted that 𝗳𝗲𝗃𝗃's climate bill is modelled very much on the experience the UK and the successful experience the UK has had with the Climate Change Act, the setting of a long-term vision for a net zero economy by 2050, and the use of 5-year rolling carbon budgets to get there. That is not something that Australia has had the benefit of, but there's a real opportunity to get behind 𝗳𝗲𝗃's bill with submissions due by the end of next week on the 27th. I'll finish up there and look forward to the further discussion with our audience going forward.
Thanks, Dean. Now let's get on our virtual Elon Musk Starlink star flight and now travel to the United Kingdom and welcome Claire O'Neill to give us her insights, particularly those of the role of business over the last year and going forward into 2021. So over to you, Claire. Claire, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'll just interrupt there. Claire, you're not on mute, so I'm not sure what's happening with your audio. Claire, we can't hear you.
Who said technology was seamless? So what we might do is get back on this Starlink and go over to New York and welcome Emily, and then we'll fly back when we've got a chance, when Claire's found the pedal power to get her technology to work. So Emily, let's now shift and talk about the investor community. And they've had a very exciting year, have they not? Tell us more.
No, they absolutely have, and you know, first I'd really like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the Lenape people of the Delaware Valley, which is where I'm currently based outside of New York City. So in terms of the investor community, I think they, as Dean mentioned, really have got a reprieve with the postponement of COP. And one of the things that we've seen is there's a real appetite for action, for acceleration, for engagement. And all of that is now coming down to, you know, what does climate science look like? What is the market providing? What does the data look like, and such? So I've been busier than ever, and instead of suffering from jet lag, suffer from time zones and calls at all hours. I'd like to take a step back. So CDP, as Andrew pointed out, is the artist formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. We are a UK-based charity. We've been around for 20 years, and our theory of change is based on getting investors in the capital markets to pressure companies and issuers to disclose about climate change issues related to emissions, water security, deforestation with soft commodity and land use. And so we collect this information. This year in 2020, we had a record 10,000 disclosures globally, including many from Australia, disclosed to us about the impacts of climate change on their businesses and the impacts that they're having on the climate as well. We're seeing increasing demand for investors to incorporate this information into their investment processes. And this is important because this is non-financial metrics. You know, we haven't seen this type of focus on standards and convergence since the great debates going back a few years on IFRS or US GAAP versus versus European GAAP and such as well. So there's a lot of focus on the data, the comparability, and what companies are doing. One of the things, being a UK-based charity, that always comes up is the EU taxonomy, and how is the EU taxonomy defining for the world what is green, what do the capital markets need to invest in, what does business need to do? But as someone who's based in North America, one of the really key developments over the course of 2020 has been the release by Canada of the Canadian taxonomy, and this is particularly important for Australia because Canada took a step back and said the EU taxonomy is an example, but the economies that operate within the EU are very different than the economies in Canada, which are very much natural resources, extractives driven, and where the land is a really important part of driving that economy, as is the financial sector. And so as we look at the taxonomy that was released in July, it's a really fantastic example for other economies like Australia, South Africa, a number of the South American countries to look and say, we have a different type of role to play at the global stage in the global dialogues around the environment. And I think when the investors that I speak with globally think about the opportunity in Australia to really play a leadership role, it's about demonstrating that transition. As we talk about investing and sustainable finance, investors aren't just saying, I want a green investment versus a brown investment. Let me do away with all of one and go all the way to the other. A significant part of what the financial institutions and investors that we are working with focuses on what does that transition look like so that we're all moving on a pathway that is sustainable and creates new economies and new business models. So we've seen a lot of interesting products and investment thesis come out of the market. We are seeing investors become more comfortable taking into account these transition plans, the climate exposure, the uncertainty that these sort of systemic risk brings. So this goes to talking about COVID, and Andrew, you were talking about, what if we would all be in Glasgow, we would all be, having conversations. I would have finished a very hectic year of traveling the globe, not minimizing my carbon footprint, and having discussions with people about, what are the central banks doing? What is the UK Bank of England stress test incentivizing for banks? What type of policy changes are we seeing coming out of Hong Kong and Singapore monetary authorities and such? But instead, everyone is now on a level playing field. We are all locked down in whatever place, hopefully, that is beautiful and serene, to really think about how we can address these problems. And because no one is missing out, it's given us an opportunity, I think, as individuals, as organizations, to really think about how we can make a change and a difference. And as a result, that has come up with a whole flurry of work around the frameworks. We've started to see the IFRS say, we are going to play a leadership position in defining what type of climate metrics are important. Going back to that systemic risk issue, at the start of the pandemic, we saw the markets dislocate. Obviously in mid to late March, as the world started waving through different lockdowns, we saw some pretty significant dislocation in the markets, investors not understanding how they wanted to trade around the systemic risk. By July, August, we saw a really sharp rebound or strong rebound because investors said, okay, this is a systemic risk. It can't be predicted. This is how we trade around that. This is how we invest around this type of big unknown. At the same time, we saw a really interesting rise where people said, okay, in addition to the pandemic being a systemic risk, what other systemic risks do we need to consider? And my team globally was, I don't want to say flooded, but we saw a market increase in interest from investors who had never really come to us or we had gotten traction with in terms of engaging around some of these environmental issues, because they recognize that climate change and the environmental issues pose a even greater systemic risk than the pandemic, and they haven't fully understood how they're going to invest around it or invest to incentivize it. And I think that's really been one of the, I hesitate to say blessings, but one of the positive outcomes that's come from this lockdown and this extension in the run-up to Glasgow. What we're seeing is, as investors get greater understanding and greater clarity of the metrics that they need to look at, the activities that businesses are taking, the changes in industry based on some of these systemic risks, they're getting more comfortable with the idea of setting their own emissions reductions targets, their own science-based targets for their investment portfolios, and how they're going to achieve that. And so looking at some of the programs that Dean is working on with the COP26 presidency, particularly around the race to zero, we're seeing financial institutions and investors in a more comfortable place to be able to meet the challenges that the international governments, as well as the COP presidency, have set for us. So let me stop there and see if Claire's back with us.
She is indeed. Thank you, Emily. And so we'll jump back on the Elon Musk Starflight, and we'll head straight over to the UK, where Claire.
No, I'm here.
Oh,
I'm here.
There she is.
I switched laptops.
So you need to pedal faster, Claire.
Yes.
We're just getting a little bit of feedback.
Hang on. That's because I'm still on this call.
I suspect that's because.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm with
Excellent.
you. It's amazing how we've all become our own IT experts. I'm so sorry. I've switched laptops, so instead of my beautiful backdrop, you get to see my daughter's bedroom. It's really good to see everyone, and very good evening from the UK. Andrew, thanks so much for the opportunity to work with you on this. So I guess the sort of starter question is, what would we be doing? Well, I served as the COP president designate for a while. I was actually the person responsible for bringing the COP to Glasgow. I spotted an opportunity at COP23 when Italy it wasn't obvious that they were going to be wanting to host the COP. So I suggested that we bring it to the UK and we partner with Italy. And I served as president designate for about 6 months and wrote the action plan that I think is still being carried out. And so I would be in Glasgow. I would have been in Glasgow in that job. I would have been in Glasgow in my current job. And let me just explain a couple of things about what the COP was trying to achieve that I think is still very much on the agenda. So those of you that are COP experts will know that in the core of the COP, the sort of beating nuclear reactor of it is simply a negotiation of a text. And you would think that was easy, but in fact, it takes 2 weeks and it's incredibly painful. And Paris was the high point of that text negotiating diplomacy. And since then, it's been really difficult to establish a kind of good outcome. In fact, Madrid was particularly difficult. As you said, there were challenges around the actual hosting of Madrid. But really, the purpose of Madrid was to try and complete the Paris rule book. And we really struggled to do that. And of course, many of the people on the call will know about the kind of Article 6 problem. So the challenge for COP26, as you said, was supposed to be right at the start of this, was supposed to be part of this super year of action, was to get the Paris rulebook completed, to focus minds on net zero. And we all throw around net zero now as if it's just a kind of acceptable term. You'll remember how controversial net zero was just a couple of years ago. This was considered to be a kind of permission to pollute target rather than actually something that we could get around. And of course, those that have been involved in SBTI for a long time will say, well, net zero was, of course it was important. That was always what we were aiming for with 1.5 or 2 degree targets, but it was very controversial. So the Glasgow COP is meant to be the net zero COP, with the aim being that all countries attend, heads of state attend, and that all of the NDCs are updated with a net zero target, which I think is a good way to focus minds. But alongside that, and this gets very much to what Dean says, there is this incredibly, the NDC is nationally determined contribution. It's the countries bringing their homework and saying, this is what we will achieve. And of course, there's a ratchet mechanism in Paris agreement, as you'll know, that will be updated every 5 years. alongside that is the incredibly important what's called the kind of real world agenda, which I always find a bit, as an ex-politician, I never understood why the real world wasn't public and private combined. But basically all the business ambition, the financial commitments that are such massive enablers, the focus on nature, which historically has not been front and center of the COP. So yes, we've had the separate COP track for nature, but in fact, really bringing nature and getting finance flowing for nature, not just for climate recovery, but to restore the natural environment, it should be a hugely important part of COP. And then finally, adaptation, that is always a little bit the orphan child of the COP discussion. It's always expressed as, we'll have another commission, we'll commit some more money, but we've never quite got to grips with what a good adaptation strategy really means. So that was the sort of original plan. I left politics, very thankfully, after 12 years, and thought really hard about what to do. And for me, what I had noticed in my ministerial job, and increasingly, was that the kind of white heat of ambition was really beating very hard in the corporate sector. You know, we had companies basically saying, we're going to be net zero by 2050, 2040, 2030. Companies saying we will get rid of every CO2 molecule we've ever emitted by deep cuts in our own emissions, as well as as investing in natural solutions. We've had some major oil and gas companies like BP and Shell basically saying we absolutely want to transition to be energy companies. And yes, we can have a debate about gas in the mix. I know that's a very live debate in Australia, but we've had oil and gas companies repricing their portfolios in a way that would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago. So there's been this massive shift in ambition. And I think for me, it perhaps resonates because a couple of facts struck me about the private sector. One is that chief executives tend to stay in post twice as long as political leaders. And secondly, this gets to Dean's point about the Climate Change Act. Companies, I think, are being much more transparent. The companies who are setting targets and setting out net zero plans are being much more transparent and being much clearer about their investment and their governance structures that will actually deliver those targets. And, in the UK, we passed the Climate Change Act over in 2008. And it's been extraordinarily helpful because it set up a really strong governance structure, because we have the Committee on Climate Change, which is independent, who give us advice. And in fact, when I brought in the net zero legislation, I was able to ask the Committee on Climate Change for advice on that. We have, as Dean said, we have to stand up in Parliament and defend these carbon budgets. And I can tell you that's not fun, because nobody really has the insight on how they're going to be decarbonising after 2035, but yet we have to set budgets for that period. And it also basically allows us to have a very clear and frank conversation with all parts of the political and business systems about what we're trying to do. And it sticks, and in fact, I was just looking through my files. I wrote this thing, which is the Clean Growth Strategy for the UK. This is a very detailed document, which I don't think any other government had or has, which is basically a sector by sector across the economy approach to how we decarbonise. So all of this just goes to say that I think businesses have this massively important role to play, both in the long-term ambition and also in the run-up to COP, because the thing that policymakers like more than anything else is commitments from the business sector in terms of spending, in terms of technology, but also they like having cover. A government who sticks its neck out and says we're going to go to net zero and hasn't had actually a conversation with its energy partners, either the generators or the distributors, to work out how they're going to do that, is a very brave government indeed. And I think the role of business now is to not just kind of lobby policymakers. WBCSD, which, by the way, if anyone's on this call and isn't a member, they should be absolutely involved talking to Andrew locally or even globally. We are the preeminent organisation, but WBCSD was set up after the Rio Earth Summit alongside the COP process to be the place that the private sector brought its ambitions for sustainability. But it's not just about lobbying, saying if only we had a carbon price, or if only we had emissions trading schemes that included natural climate solutions. It's actually about that public-private partnership that increasingly gives governments confidence to deliver. And let me share with you what I think is possibly the best example of that in the UK space. So in the UK, we're a tiny little island surrounded by seas, and it's really windy and rainy a lot of the time. And the North Sea, where of course we've pumped lots of oil and gas, is the perfect place for offshore wind. It's like having a Saudi Arabian oil field off the coast of Great Yarmouth. And we've kind of done offshore wind in dribs and drabs. We have about, I don't know, 1.5 gigawatts right now coming from that. And we'd aim to get to 3. And then we were having conversations about how we could increase that. And I did a thing called the offshore wind sector deal, where we basically said to the sector, you need to tell us what you'll commit in terms of research and development and supply chain and partnership. And we will then offer you an auction structure over the next 10 years that shows you what our demand is, the minimum demand we'd like to buy over the next 10 years. And for the first time, it gave investors certainty of that future demand for the technology and for the investment. And the price of offshore wind dropped after that deal from, originally it was like, £150 per kilowatt hour. It dropped to £57.50, and then with the offshore wind sector deal it dropped to about £39 in the space of about 3 months. So the price was dropping like a tech stock or a technology. And it's really brought home to me that if you can create that public-private partnership, you can create confidence in those technologies, in those demand and those supplies. But that takes working together. And for me, the biggest thing that I would like to see going into the COP, and also going beyond the COP, because of course the COP is just a reporting back moment, is this understanding that we do have to have partnerships for innovation, and particularly for infrastructure. Infrastructure is the incredibly boring part of the energy transition, how you move electrons around, how you work out how you'll charge up your electric vehicles, and we never talk about it enough. And actually the best way to plan that infrastructure is through a public-private partnership. So I think the COVID delay has been good for COP. I think it's given us time, as Dean said, to have some very unlikely countries, or countries we hoped would come forward with ambition, coming forward with big numbers earlier than planned. I think we've also been able to really accelerate the action agenda. I made lots of bad decisions in politics. The best decision I ever made was to hire Nigel Topping, who was great, who was leading the We Mean Business Coalition, and he and his team are doing amazing things in really accelerating that agenda. And I think that we also have a realization actually that the COVID world we're living in has delivered energy consumption drops that we used to talk about theoretically. And now we've seen what that world looks like, and we know that in order to reach net zero on the current technology patterns, we'd have to have a COVID type event every year for the next 10 years. And you know what? You can only empty the planes once. So massive reductions in energy demand are very difficult to do and are not sustainable unless we really change the tech mix. And I think this pandemic, for all its awfulness, has given us a real sense of, okay, this is a future that we don't necessarily want. There are some really good learnings from this, particularly around workplace patterns, but we're going to have to do a heck of a lot more in the real world to hit those net zero targets. I'll stop there, Andrew. Thanks for the opportunity to chat first thing in the morning with you.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, very, very insightful points made, and let's pick up on a couple of those with some of the questions that are coming through on the chat function. But as always, the moderator has the first right of asking the question, and mine is a classic one, which I feel compelled to ask. And Claire, maybe you go first in answering. Can we still afford to act given the pandemic's impact? Every national government's talking about jobs, jobs, jobs. Where's money and the appetite left to do something on this issue?
I think you and I probably know the answer to that, which is, we've got a whole series of big Build Back Better spending commitments, which of course vary. I was looking at the EU, and the EU of course has been really quietly kind of doubling down on this. And what's their spending package? They've got 1.8 trillion of a stimulus package, which is putting climate action, resilience, just transition and biodiversity, at least verbally in the forefront of that agreement. And of course, the great myth about this is that somehow acting to reduce emissions and improve that nature is jobs destructive. It's not. And I remember going to India and talking about how every forecast I'd seen implied that jobs in the solar industry in India would be 10 times greater than they were currently in the coal industry. It's a transition that is difficult, but it's a transition that is necessary. And actually the job creation opportunities and the new skills are enormous. So I think governments, it's in their economic interest to act in this way and to be creative. And again, companies realize this too, that, one of the things that is difficult for fossil fuel companies now is they find it hard to recruit. So my daughter, in fact, was involved in the Keep Warwick University campus free of fossil fuel companies, which I thought was a bit bizarre, as her grandpa used to work for Shell. But there is a sense now that if you want to attract good talent and you want to be investing in those jobs, this is just part of what you have to do. And for me, the governments are lining up to spend a ton of money on the COVID recovery. And if we're smart, we make sure that goes into jobs generating policies that really help the transition.
Yeah. And Dean, you must be finding this question being pondered as the year has progressed, and I guess the glide path of opportunity around the investment that governments are looking to make are being looked at from a very short term, but there are glimmers of hope in relation to a longer term view. We're talking about the EU, perhaps now as a result of the Biden administration. What's the sense of the response by the people that you're talking to around the affordability of acting, notwithstanding the impact of COVID?
I think one of the critical levers here has been the extraordinary leadership of the UN Secretary General in establishing very early in the COVID recovery discussion and efforts his 6 principles for building back better, and that language has been used right across the globe as an underpinning principle for those recovery efforts. I think there is still some concern that the massive stimulus packages are unhealthily weighted in the direction of the fossil fuel industry, particularly in some countries. And obviously, there's been a very significant discussion in Australia about the appropriateness or the wisdom of a gas-led recovery for Australia, and we're now seeing a bit of pushback on that. For example, the report that came from the Grattan Institute over recent days suggesting that money flowing to the gas industry was not necessarily money well spent, given the extraordinary transition we're seeing in the energy sphere globally. In terms of affordability, as Claire said, there are plenty of studies, including from the IEA, as I mentioned earlier, which show that there is much more to be gained from investment in the green economy than investment in the old economy. For example, some figure that for every dollar spent, you get 3 more jobs out of a green investment than out of an old grey investment. So that really just speaks for itself. And I think the notion that we can't afford to pursue this kind of green recovery from COVID is starting to be shown through various analyses, not necessarily to be the truth anymore. So I think things are moving in the right direction, and we can see it not only from government but also from the investor sphere and in the corporate sphere as well. I think one of the big initiatives that's bubbling along very nicely is some of the biggest investors globally signing up to the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and starting to work now on interim targets for their work, targets for coal phase out for their investments. And also we're seeing some of the biggest companies globally start to move in this direction as well. So not even sticking with what some would have viewed 5 years ago as the very ambitious net zero by 2050, but Apple bringing that forward to 2030, Amazon bringing that forward to 2040. So we're seeing huge movement. I think 2050 might not be the zeitgeist another 5 years from now, might be somewhat earlier than that, as the economic realities of the benefits of the transition hit home.
Yeah, that is an interesting observation around the mobilisation of the capital markets, and I wanted to bring Emily back into this particular question. It's not as if there is no money swashing around the system at the moment. In fact, there's vast tranches of it. So what's the investor community looking at the signal or the signals to actually unleash that money into a post-COVID build forward better recovery that embraces net zero?
Sure. Well, you know, there are a couple of things. I mean, I'd agree with what Claire and Dean have said with respect to can we afford to do this? Absolutely, and there are a lot of plans that have been made for that. And I think that there is plenty of private sector appetite, particularly in the capital markets, to invest. However, that isn't just investment writ large. There are many investors who have been burned by clean tech 1.0 in kind of the early mid 2000s, and that's left some scars, and both I think on the government side and on the investor side. So I see government, national, subnational governments bringing us projects and saying, look, if only we could get $60 million, $150 million, $200 million for this. And the investors are saying, wait a sec, I'm focused on preservation of capital and growth of that. Dean brought up the asset owners. They're perpetual owners. They're universal owners. They need to own for a lifetime. So while they are absolutely prepared to invest in transition plans, in planning for the future, in proven green technologies, in making the green technology, the sustainable technology, those business practices standard, I think that there is still a lot of skepticism to investing in that bleeding edge technology or that project that relies on government subsidies. So, going back to your first question about can the recovery from the pandemic, afford a focus on sustainability? Absolutely, no question. But it's really going to come down to where investors are allocating that capital, and they're going to support sustainable investments, just not necessarily the ones that have the biggest, flash around them. Yeah. And Claire, bring you back in. You've got an observation to make as well.
I just want to pick on that. It's a really excellent point, because I think, every country can learn or every group can learn so much from what's gone before. You see Japan now, who've set out this incredibly ambitious and tough net zero by 2060 target, which means them coming off coal very dramatically. We have made terrible mistakes in renewable deployment. Germany has spent an absolute fortune. We've practically bankrupted the European utility sector, except it's state-owned, so you don't see that, by forcing companies to do the wrong thing and investing in the wrong kind of tech. And I think there is so much learning that again, we've all developed from the policy environment and also from the business environment. And if we're serious, we need to stop kind of, pretending and just come up with the kind of best solution for a particular thing. So I think it's a really powerful point. I'm not swanky about this, but I had a call with John Kerry last week in another forum, and it was really striking. So they have incredibly ambitious plans and they have a lot of money. Of course, they have a question about how much they can get out of the Senate for support. But we were sort of urging him to not go down the road of, okay, let's put a solar panel on everyone's roof, because America has some big problems to fix, like no national grid that they're going to need if they really want to do massive renewables deployment. So often the kind of easy fixes that the politicians come up with are the ways for everyone to lose tons of money. And if I can just share, if I may, we used to have a program to pay people to put solar panels on their homes, feed-in tariffs. We guaranteed a price. It will cost £24 billion over its lifetime, and it's the most regressive policy we've ever done. Why? Because it rewarded people with capital who could afford to pay for the solar panels with their pensions in many cases, and we put that bill on poor people's energy bills. And so our energy policies, if we want to have a really just transition, that has to also start at home. I love renewables. I'm a massive fan of offshore wind, but you know what? It's a lot blowier than it is sunnier in the UK, and that was an idea we imported and copied. And by the way, Australia, you guys could cover the entire central belt with amazing solar and create lots of hydrogen and export it. And I say that with not knowing enough. I'm sure there's other reasons, but let's learn from our mistakes. Let's really go to where the most impact can be, and let's make sure the private money flows in behind that.
Thanks for that. Yes, I was going to make some cheap comment about borders, but I won't. So I'm going to go to the questions that we're having coming flooding in, by the way, and one that has caught my eye because it's brought me back to the question of the science. It's quite a good one, and I'll open it up to all three. So feel free to chime in. What are we expecting the impact of the delayed IPCC report in terms of its, I guess, impact on COP26 negotiations? Anybody got any thoughts, insights, insider information? You're among friends.
Dean, you want to have a go?
Yeah, so well, the IPCC process is quite a complicated one and a very kind of stepwise process. So ordinarily for each assessment report, including for the sixth assessment report, which is being written at the moment, there are 3 working group reports that build up to the main report. Now, from my perspective, the report I think that's most important as an input to the COP proceedings is Working Group 1, which focuses on the kind of scientific underpinnings and analysis of the climate problem. We already have more than enough analyses of the mitigation curves that are required to hit the 1.5 degree warming limit enshrined in the Paris Agreement. But I think Working Group 1 will come out about the middle of next year, or potentially around as late as September, but we will have it at our disposal in advance of the COP. So I think the main additive benefit that we will get from a policy decision-making perspective will be to have that report in our hands, and that's not going to be delayed. The full report taking in all 3 working groups will come out mid-2022, but as I said, the main aspect, we will have at our disposal.
But if I could just share something that so I think the IPCC has done an amazing job, and there isn't almost never now, well, I'm sure you do in certain pockets, but the science, the power of the science and the impact of warming has been so well expressed by this group of scientists. It's been so powerful. Here's a really depressing fact. If you sit in the negotiation halls in the COP, people don't really pay attention to the science. And last year, we had 500,000 protesters outside the COP. We had the IPCC report, which was incredibly powerful on 1.5 degrees. And I sat in a plenary where we negotiated for half an hour whether the meeting we were in was an informal or an informal. And we just don't have time for this crap. I'm sorry. And so one of the things I'm really keen to do is that we hold the negotiations and the ministers to account. I wanted to live stream the COP. This was considered revolutionary. We do not have time for people to sit around in a zero-sum climate diplomacy game. And it is shocking how little attention is paid both to the science and also to the sort of will of the people. And if there's one thing we can all do, it's to make sure our negotiators and our ministers go to these COP next year absolutely prepared to negotiate hard for their own country's position, but also prepared for action. And this is where Dean and the action agenda, I think, is so important, because, we will just get on with it. And if they get stuck on Article 6, that's fine, because we're going to have a voluntary market that's incredibly high standard already delivering. And I think that's the lesson we have to keep getting through. The negotiators don't own the COP. The citizens of the world own the COP.
Yeah, as I've been asked to explain to Australian audiences after many COPs, give us a sense of how one of these COPs work. And I always revert to, well, imagine a local council meeting on steroids.
But with no observer, but without the public allowed in.
Nobody in the room actually casting an eye on them in relation to their deliberations. Exactly right. Look, we've got a lot of questions, but I would like to pick up on Monica Richter's question, which I also think is an interesting one, around the Australian-UK FTA that's going on at the moment. And it is true to say that our Prime Minister probably hasn't had the discussion about climate change and net zero and climate action so much on his call sheet as he's had in the last week with his discussions with both UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and then President-elect Joe Biden. But Monica's question is around what kinds of carrots might be dangled to encourage Australia to put in place a target around net zero by 2050, and perhaps even more ambitious medium-term targets. Perhaps not necessarily focused just on Australia, because I think it's probably relevant in a broader global context to countries like our friends in Canada, although they obviously have the effect of a national carbon price working. But how can we incentivize those countries that are perhaps on the cusp of being ambitious, but are getting a little concerned about the water just being a little too cold before they dive into it?
Well, I will just
take a stab at that.
Just jump in and say one of the reasons that China's come up with its net zero plans is because President Macron and the EU have done an amazing job, basically both encouraging but also threatening carbon border tax adjustments, which is a live debate in the EU. It's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I am a big fan of trade deals that relate to climate ambition. The UK government's sort of Brexit trade deal policy did not include that. We were basically going gangbusters for whatever trade deals we could get, and actually declined the EU's invitation to include climate-related issues. Having said that, the Biden administration and the realization that the COP is the UK's big moment in the sun next year, I think will hopefully change that. My sense is it'll be more about carrots than sticks, though. The Prime Minister does not like tariff impositions. So it'll be a lot of encouragement, I would think, rather than particular trade adjustments. Dean might have a different view.
Yeah, Claire, I just wanted to take you up on the point as to whether you'll be able to deliver a moment in the sun in Glasgow next November.
We can promise you a deep fried Mars bar, Dean.
All right, excellent. All right, I mean, Andrew, just on what kind of carrots could be dangled. I mean, I've always found it most persuasive and effective to focus in each individual country on why it's in that country's national interest to actually pursue the policy we're after. So, for example, the Australian situation is quite a unique one because of the political history around climate policy. It's seen the back of 3 or 4 prime ministers in the past, and obviously Scott Morrison now is worried that if he goes ahead with a net zero target, he'll lose the hard right of the party and his majority in the parliament. But very clearly, there is a lot of empirical evidence now that it is flatly in Australia's national interest to pursue a net zero by 2050 target and all that comes along with it. The second thing I think, and this is why I was very attracted to work with Nigel in this space over the next 12 months, is that very often when you have big companies, big investors, big technology developers, all moving in the same direction, it tends to create the political space domestically for an adjustment of policy. And so what I think we're seeing now is we're moving not to a kind of top-down government sets the policy and everyone follows, but rather the reverse of that, where basically we've got a bottom-up groundswell of climate action that then makes it completely logical that the government will follow up with the policy itself. So I think those two aspects are really important.
Thanks for that, and that's a good way to, in fact, wrap up this element of the Q&A session, because we now need to close this particular session formally. But before we do, and just as a signal to my BSA colleagues, we won't do the second poll because we don't need to. Let's talk about the call to action. So what's in it for you? What can you contribute to? The simple answer is take some action. Get onto the website of BFA and sign the declaration. Tell Australians that you support ambitious action. Share your story on the website. Tell 9 people today, however you can, in conversations that you have, whether they're Zoom or they're at the coffee shop. Get involved in collaborative climate action and advocacy, and register for the upcoming sector discovery session. And of course, play your part you can plan for your attendance, whether actual or virtual, at the Better Futures Forum, which will be held in July of 2021. On your behalf, thank you to our fantastic speakers, to Emily, New York, to Claire in her daughter's bedroom in London, and Dean looking very resplendent, sitting outside on a deck somewhere in Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was delightful. Hopefully it's a great taster for the rest of the day's conversation. But for now, thank you very much for coming. And if you haven't registered for the next 2 sessions, can we also encourage you to do so? But as I say, for now, my name is Andrew Petersen from the BCSD Australia. Thank you so much for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.